And let me say immediately, welcome to all nearly 60 people now in the room. It's wonderful. This is one of the few privileges and advantages of this COVID season that we've learned and got used to doing these webinars. And I'm very happy to be doing this today. I want to say, kick off your shoes and let this week-long tired body rest, but please give us your mind. Keep your mind active and engaged this afternoon. It is our first webinar, and I want to say welcome to our first webinar. It's the first in what's going to be a series of webinars that we're doing for the rest of the year. Every Friday at 2 o'clock, there will be a webinar. There will be something interesting to look at, to discuss. We are having topics like, say, the cost of ICT in government. I mean, I think that is specifically of interest to all of us. Let me give you just a taste. I've got a whole list until the end of the year. I'm going to just give you a taste of some of them. Cost of ICT, the cost of ICT and SAP, the cost of ICT in education. Some of the feasibility work that we've done on the SANSA space infrastructure. We're going to talk about the technical support that was given to Buffalo City. We're going to look at some of the work that was done on the border posts. We're going to look at the cost differential between provinces on building provincial roads. There's a range of topics that we are going to do. We are going to look at these ideas, these projects that we've done in GTAC, which we want to discuss in a very informal way. It's not going to be super fancy. There's no big drama to prepare. I'm asking for 10 to 15 slides on a matter so that we can discuss our findings with people that are interested. We want to talk about the insights that we have achieved, the implications of what we are seeing, and also, frankly, to discuss our methodologies. We want to know, are we asking the right questions? Are there better ways of doing this? We need to have open discussions. Relaxed, no protocol, questions, disagreements, but let's follow the Chatham House rules, where what you say on Friday is not used against you on Monday. We want an intellectual ferment. I often think we need this intellectual ferment in government. We can't just come up with the same answers to the same questions. We've got to get new ideas and new insights. And if you're not challenged by a big audience that keep on asking you difficult questions, how do you shift? How do you improve? So please invite people. It's an open, wide audience. We've started today and we've invited all of the GTAC staff, all of the GTAC long-term assistants, and we've invited our mothership National Treasury. So I want to say a special word of thanks to all of the people from the Treasury side. More than welcome. We'll be talking to each other a lot over the next 6 months, but welcome today especially. But I want to say that this wonderful intellectual ferment, which we imagine to be happening at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, is not the only thing we're going to be doing on a Friday. There's also more. And for those that want to leave after the seminar, obviously, welcome. We've had our discussion, you know, you're welcome. But for those that want to stay on for a small little training moment, we're going to call it Fundanati. So we are going to be teaching each other small moments, just not long, big seminars on something, but just like, let's learn something together that's small and digestible. And these Fundanati moments are going to be things like how to use Teams in an optimal way, how to present in a way that your slides actually are attractive and convey your ideas. How do you carry yourself in presentation? How do you improve your writing? Writing courses is perhaps in the background as well. How do you use some Excel functions? I mean, you know, 3, 4 Excel functions and then we all go home again. So some of the basic making our office work easier will be after the seminar. So there will be 2 sections. There will be the webinar on a Friday afternoon at 2. And then after the webinar, for those that want to stay on, we're going to have a Fundanati moment. We're going to, you know, learn from each other and teach each other. So I find that quite exciting and I'm very glad it's happening. Please have your cup of coffee and your tea ready. Let's start our first webinar. So I want to welcome Antony Altbeker. Antony is your If you want to put your video on that people can see you, that there's a person there. It's always nice to see the face behind these letters or even the photos of the team's situation. Antony has a wealth of government experience. Just post 94, he was a ministerial advisor to Minister Mufamadi in the safety and security environment. And he's been a consultant and an author of 3 books subsequently. He's also had a long time involvement with National Treasury as an official in public finance space and as in various budget office advisory capacities for the longest time. He has lately, since 2017, applied his sharp, skeptical, and great mind to this understanding the nature of the salary bill of government. And I want to emphasize the sharp, skeptical, and great mind. And I hope you'll see it this afternoon in action. Antony, welcome. Thank you for taking the first seminar for us. Please guide us into your insights that you've achieved around the cost of employment and what is the impact on the trajectory of our public finance in this country around the cost of employment. Antony, thank you.
Thank you, Renette, for those kind words. You were encouraging people to ask hard questions. I would encourage everybody not to ask me any hard questions at all today. Treat me kindly. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, we can.
But now why can't I? Sorry, for some reason I can just see pictures of everybody else, but not my slides. There we go. Now it's coming.
Antony will be our first guest in the little Fundanati moment on how to run the team slideshows.
No, but I did what I always do, and now it's just slowly coming. I don't know. Maybe it's not so much the. It seems that they're having difficulty loading my presentation, is what PowerPoint is telling me at the moment. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about compensation spending trends that we've seen over the last 15 years and what we know about them and what kind of policy challenges they present to us and how we've kind of been thinking about it and what the approach government has had to adopt in dealing with the challenge. And the first thing to do when you think about it is just kind of take a step back and think about compensation spending in relation to the budget as a whole and in relation to the sustainability and the path on which our public finances are on. So what I've got on the graph is the red line is government spending and the green line is government revenues, our tax revenues. And what you can see is that starting in just after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, a large gap opened up between spending and revenues. And although we've tried to close that gap, we've never actually been able to do so. And then obviously by the time you get to 2020, well, when you get to 2020, the gap just dramatically widens as a result of COVID and the effects of that on the economy. And so that's that story of a structural deficit that has opened, a very large structural deficit that's opened and we failed to close, is the critical story in the story of our public finances. Within that story, there's a role played by the compensation budget and compensation spending. So the mustardy colored mountain at the bottom is what's happened to compensation spending over that time, and the snow-capped peaks on that mountain, that's the debt service costs that have been mounting as well as a result of this the borrowing we've had to do because of the structural gap between spending and revenue. So we've got compensation spending that's been rising, that's pushed up.
You're saying I mean, these are small portions.
Sorry, can I ask it? Everybody mute themselves. Please mute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry, was that? I mean, if there's a question, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Spending is compensation spending is around 35% of spending overall as a general proposition. It's been growing faster than spending as a whole. It hasn't been growing as fast as debt service costs. Debt service costs is the fastest growing item on the budget at the moment. So how do we understand what's going on the compensation budget? Well, compensation spending is driven by two main variables. I mean, and basically the only two variables, and those are the only two variables really that government has to control or to expand it or contract compensation spending. The first variable is the number of people who are employed, headcounts, and the second is remuneration, how much people are paid in government. And over time, it's been those two that have driven what's happened on compensation spending. And over the last 15 years, the kind of critical point that the analysis shows is that after you discount inflation, all the new resources that have been made available for compensation spending over the past 15 years, they've been allocated 3-to-1 to raising average remuneration rather than increasing headcounts. So as a general proposition, the policy over the last 15 years has been to raise public service remuneration rather than to expand employment in the public service. In thinking about these two levers, headcounts and remuneration, we need to think also about the decision-making processes that drive both of those two variables. Remuneration levels are ultimately set through a process of collective bargaining. That collective bargaining happens at the center of government. It's obviously government doesn't control the outcome of that by itself. Obviously, it is collective bargaining. But it is the center of government that drives the outcomes of that represents government as a whole in the bargaining chamber. Employment, on the other hand, is ultimately those choices are made by heads of department. So although the DPSA represents the employer in collective bargaining, in practice in the South African state, every department is its own employer. Every head of department makes their own decisions in relation to the number of people they can employ. Obviously, within the budget that is set by National Treasury or Provincial Treasury, depending on where the department is. It's important to understand that asymmetry in control because the heads of department have no real ability to control levels of remuneration. And the center of government has only limited capacity to control what departmental heads are doing in terms of filling vacancies or expanding their establishments. So there's this asymmetry of authority in these in the two variables, and that means that decision making is not like it can't be controlled from one central point because there is no central point that controls both of those variables. The critical lesson that we have learned over the last two or 3 years is that if you are seeking to control compensation spending overall, it is much easier to achieve a big impact by controlling through the lever of controlling remuneration than it is by attempting to change headcounts. It turns out to be really difficult for National Treasury or for the central government to control the way departments make decisions about the size of their establishments. Departments have approved establishments, and when there are vacancies, they make decisions to fill or not fill vacancies, often without complete clarity about whether they can really afford that or not. So there's much more power to control overall compensation spending through the lever of managing remuneration levels than there is through managing headcounts. The fundamental challenge that we've got in the country is that in thinking about compensation spending is that the rate of growth of remuneration spending in the public service has been much faster than the rate of growth of the economy has permitted. And what's in on that graph is the red line is average remuneration in the public service, and the green line is per capita GDP in South Africa. And obviously, there's always going to be a large gap between those two numbers. Per capita GDP is GDP divided by every single person in the country, including children, retired people, the unemployed, whereas obviously public servants, it's everybody's employed, and everybody and public sector jobs are generally well paid. So there's always going to be a large gap between those two lines. What's critical about those two lines is the difference in the slope. Per capita GDP is really a measure of how much a country can afford to spend on whatever item you're looking at. If remuneration is growing much faster than the capacity of the economy to produce the resources to pay for the public sector, you're on a path that is going to lead you into some kind of crisis at some point. That's not. It's kind of the definition of unsustainable for something for spending on something as large as public sector remuneration to grow much faster than GDP as a whole, which is what's been happening for the last 15 years. So when you've got that kind of gap between the rate of growth of the economy and the rate of growth of remuneration, there's really only three options that are available. One is, which is ultimately the preferred option, is to figure out how to make the economy grow much more quickly. The other two are to slow remuneration growth or to slow the rate of growth of headcounts, because at some point the economy is going to run out of capacity to afford a public service if remuneration grows much faster than the economy does. So let's break this down a little bit, and let's think about the two variables, the headcounts and remuneration, and I'll give you some picture of what's been going on for the last 15 years. Basically, headcounts have grown. If you look at the whole period from 2006 to the present, headcounts have grown really quite slowly across national and provincial governments. What growth, and they've increased, you'll see in a moment, they've increased by about 17% over that period, which is slower than the rate of population growth in the country. Growth has been led by the health sector, and the largest increase amongst nurses. Employment growth in education is and education is the largest employer in government. That's basically been stable since 2009, the number of people employed in the education sector. In policing, which is also a large sector, there was rapid growth of employment between 2006 and 2012, and in particular before 2010, before the World Cup. But since then, there's been a decline in employment in policing. The policy and administrative departments, of which we are obviously one, grew quite strongly until 2016, but since then have been shrinking. There's been, in relation to the mix of how the establishment is composed, there's been a degree of what we call grade inflation. So the structure of employment from most junior to most senior, from least well remunerated to most well remunerated, has shifted. So the headcount growth has been fastest at levels 5 and then at levels 10 to 12, and headcounts have actually shrunk in levels 1 to 4 and at level 6. So it's at the bottom that there's been a decline in the number of people employed, and there's been much faster growth in employment levels at higher levels. There's some interprovincial variation, which is interesting. We've done quite a lot of work on the provinces recently, but those data are quite messy because of some function shifts, in particular the TVET colleges, which used to be a provincial function and then were all shifted to DHET, and SASA, which used to be a provincial function and is now in an entity. And then there's also an issue of boundary changes, which have really messed up some of the analysis of trends at the provincial level. And I'm going to show you in a minute that there's quite large, significant differences in the per capita number of officials by province. So just to put some numbers to some of those conclusions that I've just given you, so between 2006 and 2020, there was about a 17% increase in the number of people employed in government. So it went from about 1.14 million people to about 1.34 million people employed by government. That's a 17% increase. But what's important is that almost all of that growth happened between 2006 and 2011. So there's been very, very little growth in employment in the public sector since 2011. From 2011 to 2016, there was 0% growth. from 2016 to 2020, there was 1% growth. So really the public sector is the same size now as it was 10 or 11 years ago. The fastest growth was in social development, but that's quite a small base. So it's about 10,000 people. The increase is about 10,000 people. That's quite a large growth growth rate, but it doesn't compare very well against health, where health the number of people employed in the health function has increased by about 37%, or about 120,000 people over that period. And in fact, in 2020, 2021, that increased further in response to COVID. So it's quite broad-based, the increase in headcounts, but it is driven by health. Health and education and policing are essentially the three biggest functions in government. This is some data on headcounts by province. Now, obviously, these are per capita numbers. So these are the number of officials per 1,000 people who live in the per province. And what's important about this is you can see that the thick red line in the middle, that's the average. And you can see that it's been falling since about 2012. So of course, if the number of officials is stagnant for 10 years, but the population increases, then obviously the number of officials per capita falls. And so that number has varied from about 16 per 1,000 people in the country to about 18 at its peak, and has come back down to 16. There are quite wide differences between the provinces, which is interesting. So the poorer provinces have much larger numbers of officials per capita than the richer, more urban provinces do. That's partly because of the nature of the redistributive function that happens through the fiscus. So we allocate more resources to poorer provinces, but it's also got to do with the kind of the nature of the fact that the denser, more urban provinces are actually easier to service for government, and so fewer people per capita it's possible to provide those services. One of the things that's interesting, and which I guess when we first found it was quite surprising for us, was just how high the rate of churn is in the public sector. You know, everyone says that public servants, jobs for life, but in fact, there's quite a lot of churn in the public service. And in fact, it's just a little bit less in an average year, a little less than 6% of staff leave the public service. And when I say leave the public service, we've got a very, very strict definition of what we mean by terminate their employment. It basically means that if somebody was paid in 1 year, they are not paid anything in the following year. So we are excluding kind of temporary teachers and people who might leave and then come back or anything like that. This is people who were paid in 1 year and were not paid at all in the next year. And so it's quite a strict definition of termination. And so we're fairly confident that this number is quite high. Obviously, a lot of that is people, contracts coming to the end, but some of it is also retirements, and then there's obviously resignations as well. Much fewer people are dismissed. So what's interesting and important about that variable is that that's the kind of variable that heads of departments use to manage their compensation budgets. That's the natural attrition, right? So because people are leaving the public service, it is possible to control your compensation spending just by not filling posts. And that's what natural attrition is. And because churn is actually quite high, it's possible to make quite a lot of progress if departments really want to. If they really need to reduce spending, there's quite a lot of space to reduce spending by not filling posts. This is not something we advocate, however. It's a very, very blunt instrument, the non-filling of posts. Natural attrition is not is basically the opposite of a strategic approach to restructuring a public service, because basically you're relying on people leaving in order to shape the future public service. But it is, as a mathematical fact, it is possible to reduce compensation spending quite quickly just by not filling posts. So that's what's happened with with headcounts, and as I said, the increase is quite small. Over a 15-year period, a 17% increase in headcounts is pretty small. So what's happened with remuneration? Well, remuneration has been a big driver of rising compensation spending in government. And in real terms, after you discount inflation, real average remuneration rose by nearly 50% between 2006 and 2019. In 2020, with the decision not to implement the third year of the 2018 three-year wage agreement, real average remuneration came down for the first time. It came down by about 2% in 2020. So what's driven wage growth over that period, particularly up to 2019? So the first big driver of that is that if you go all the way back to 2006, what you're looking at is a public service before the implementation of the occupational specific dispensations. So the OSDs come in and they do raise average remuneration in the public sector, particularly for people in some OSD groups. It's not exclusive to the OSD groups. There are quite large increases in average remuneration even for non-OSD public servants around that time. But it is definitely the case that the implementation of the OSD groups did substantially raise the average remuneration in the public sector. And that all kind of plays out between about 2007 and 2009 when all the OSDs have been established. Since then, annual adjustments have been driven essentially by agreements where it's been CPI plus. So that CPI plus, that plus is what has driven real average remuneration growth, combined with, because progression is in addition to the cost of living adjustments. So progression, which is now standardized at 1.5% for all qualifying personnel per year, it's been much more messy over in previous years. The police, it used to be 4% every 3 years, and teachers, it used to be 2% every. There was a lot of variation across the public service in how progression was implemented, but it was always over and above the cost of living adjustment. So those two, the CPI plus as well as progression, that's a big driver of the 40% increase in real remuneration. Then there's some increases in non-wage benefits, housing and medical. These are quite small in relation to although those increases are faster than the rise in average remuneration, because housing and medical are actually quite small proportions of overall compensation spending. The impact isn't very large in overall spending. And then, as I said earlier, there's been changes in the distribution of staff across salary levels. So there's been a decline in the number of people at the lowest salary levels and an increase in officials at higher salary levels. So that's all combined to drive this fast growth in average remuneration. What's important about the adjustments that have been made to remuneration is that they've been generally progressive, in the sense that the rate of growth in remuneration has been much faster at the bottom of the public sector than at the top of the public sector. So at the very top, in levels 13 and above, there hasn't really been a real wage increase at all since 2006, and people at that level are earning today roughly what they were earning, what people at that level were earning 10 or 15 years ago. Below the SMS, however, remuneration levels have increased quite a lot, and the further down you go, the faster that increase has been. This gives another picture into that, and what we try to do is just look at the distribution of income in the public sector over time. So if you look at the graph on the bottom left, you can see that the green, which is officials earning between 60,000 and 100. These, by the way, these remuneration numbers, they're all in real terms. So they're all in 2020 rand. So they've been adjusted for inflation. So this is not picking up any changes in the value of the rand. These are real changes. So in 2006, the proportion of people earning between 60 and 120,000 rand was like 25% of the public service. That's now like 10% of the public service. So there's a much smaller proportion of people are earning the equivalent of 120,000 rand a year in the public service today than was the case 15 years ago. And a much larger proportion is earning much greater salaries. So if you look at the table, in 2006, the median salary in the public sector, so the person in the middle of the distribution from the least well-paid to the most well-paid, was earning about 190,000 rand a year in 2020 rands, in inflation-adjusted rands. The median income now in the public sector is closer to 300,000 rand. So there's been very substantial increases right across the spectrum, and a big upward shift in remuneration in the public service. People often say this is about the OSDs, and it is true, as I said earlier, that when the OSDs were introduced, they created a kind of step change. And it's also true that people on the OSDs earn more than people who are on the ordinary public service. So the green line is the average income for people on OSDs, and the yellow line is the average income for people who are not in OSD groups. Red is obviously the average of the two averages. And what you can see, there's quite a big gap between average income for on the OSDs and average income for ordinary public servants. But what's also important about that graph is that the rate of growth of those salaries is exactly the same. So between 2009, which is roughly when you can start comparing them properly because all the OSD groups have been established, between 2009 and 2020, both incomes of both OSD officials and non-OSD officials have increased by about 27% in real terms.
Anthony, I'm giving you a 10-minute warning. 10
minutes. I'll be done. This is just for information, just about how what the OSD salaries look like at the moment. I've arranged it from the best paid OSD groups, whose judges, about 1.9 million rand a year on average for judges, all the way through to interns at the bottom, who earn about 70,000 rand a year. But the big groups are the ones in green. So there's medical, which is not just doctors; it includes some other categories as well, like ambulance drivers and the like. They're 47. There's nearly 50,000 people in that OSD group. They earn on average about 800,000 rand a year. Education is a very big group. It's the biggest group apart from non-OSD public servants. The average is 460,000 rand a year. Correctional services, nursing, SAPs, you can see they're all somewhat lower, but the average for the public sector as a whole in 2020, 2021 was about 420,000 rand a year. So like I've said it already, but 2020 was different. And how was it different? Well, this table just compares 2019 and 2020. And what you can see in the first set of columns is that there was a 1% increase in the number of public servants in 2020 compared to 2019. So the number of public servants increased from 1,329,000 to 1,337,000. So that was an increase of 1% overall. It's a bit of a mix. There's quite a large increase in the number of nurses. There's a decline in the number of police officers. There's quite a large increase in doctors and lawyers as well. What's important is the second set of columns, however, and that's average remuneration. Now, this is in nominal terms. It's not adjusted for inflation. What you can see is that in nominal terms, average remuneration rose by only 0.5% in 2019, 2020. And that's all down to the non-implementation of the third year of the 2018 wage agreement. So that's a very substantial change from what has previously been the pattern. And that was really the decision that was taken before the 2020 budget, not to implement the wage agreement, and obviously that's gone through litigation, and we've just recently, in fact, barely 10 days ago, we've got judgment finally in the Constitutional Court in favour of, well, in government's favour, finding that the original agreement was unlawful because the Minister of Finance never signed off on it. So what does all of this mean? So to reiterate, there are only two variables that really matter for compensation spending: how many people are employed and what are their average conditions of employment. Which of these variables should be shaping the future path of the compensation budget now? And these are the kind of big strategic questions, big policy questions that I think government needs to grapple with over the next few years. Obviously, the budget sets out some constraints on what the outcome can be, because the budget says how much you can spend on compensation spending over the MTEF. But what the mix is between remuneration changes and headcount changes, that's not determined by the budget. The budget just says what the bottom line is, how much you can spend. So considerations in thinking about those questions. The first is that in the recent past, it has been remuneration rather than headcounts that have dominated changes to compensation spending. That's true up to 2019, when rising remuneration dominated changes in headcounts, and it's also true in 2020 when essentially a wage freeze is what drives the reduction in spending, or the stabilization of spending on compensation. As I said earlier, there are two different, the two variables are controlled quite differently. The center of government in collective bargaining has some modicum of control over remuneration. Departments, on the other hand, are kind of price takers. They have very little control over remuneration. They've got some control over employment levels. There are some other considerations. There's some evidence that the South Africa's public sector is smaller than is the case in other countries. As a percentage of adults employed, the South African public sector is not very large. It's certainly not larger than many peer countries. What is also true, however, is that what evidence exists about this seems to suggest that South African public sector is pretty well paid compared to the public sectors of other countries, using various different kinds of metrics. There's a lesson to be learned from 2020. So what that graph that's reproduced from the budget review. Basically, the red line is what was happening from 2014 to 2019 in terms of total compensation spending. The dotted green line is what would have happened if it just followed, if we continue to follow that path. And what you can see is that in 2019, 2020, in 2020, 2021, the trajectory, there's quite a sharp structural break from the previous pattern, and the compensation spending flattens out considerably. There's two lines there. The one is with the non-pensionable allowance, and the other is without the non-pensionable allowance. And you can see that even if you include the non-pensionable allowance, we're still considerably below the old trajectory. So between 2012 and 2019, the average rate of growth of compensation spending was about 7% a year. Between now and the end of the MTEF, we're expecting it to grow by only 2% a year. Now, that sets some pretty tight limits on what can happen in relation to headcounts and average remuneration over that period, because if total spending can only increase by 2% a year, then if remuneration rises at 2% a year, then headcounts can't increase. If remuneration rises by more than 2% a year, then headcounts actually have to fall in order to achieve that budget. So that's essentially the point of the slide, which basically says that if remuneration were to rise by 3% a year, as opposed to the budget, which rises at only 2% a year, that means that headcount reductions in the order of about 13,000 a year would have to be required in order to balance the budget, and that's per year. So these are per year average changes. So the budget that's been set is a very tight budget for compensation spending. There are no easy solutions on remuneration. You know, we know now that there's a very powerful approach for controlling overall compensation spending. It is a very dispersed power, because heads of department actually ultimately control head counts. They have no control over remuneration. If remuneration levels exceed what their budgets allow, then they are essentially required to reduce headcounts, even though they are probably they're reluctant to do so. So this is a very powerful way of controlling compensation spending, but it's enormously difficult politically. I mean, this is obvious. I don't need to tell anybody here how hard, how complicated that is, because obviously, you know, we're all quite keen to see our remuneration go up, and that's true across the world. It's true in every sector, and certainly true in the public sector that people have expectations of growing remuneration. The fact of the matter is that remuneration has grown much faster than the economy has allowed, but that doesn't really change the fact that it's politically enormously difficult to change and sustain a change in the trajectory of remuneration. It's just objectively hard to keep winning that battle. Nor is it all that easy to manage headcounts. Firstly, because of the distributed nature of the power to control headcount. So heads of departments get to make those choices. They're under enormous pressure to deliver services. They're under enormous pressure to maintain levels of employment, particularly in, you know, I mean, you can imagine that in poorer provinces, maintaining employment levels in government is incredibly important because there aren't too many jobs outside of the public sector in many parts of the country. So it's not easy for heads of department to control headcount, nor do they necessarily want to. Because they want to deliver services, they also want to ensure that employment levels remain high. In addition, they don't really have very good tools for controlling headcounts. The tool that's most readily available to them is through natural attrition. As I said earlier, natural attrition is a very blunt instrument and a very unfortunate instrument for trying to change the shape and size of the public sector, because effectively what you're doing is you're not in control over who stays and who goes, and so you can have very adverse changes that you don't want because of the nature of who leaves and who doesn't leave in the public sector. So it's really not a very attractive method for controlling headcounts, if that were the strategy for controlling overall compensation spending. Critically, reducing headcounts affects service delivery. Obviously it does. And so it is actually very difficult and undesirable for lots of reasons to be concerned about, and you know, there's very good reasons to be concerned about a headcount reduction strategy for controlling compensation spending. So my final slide. The difficulties are really profound, very hard to get around them. Over the last 15 years, we've dug quite a deep hole because rising compensation spending has created problems of sustainability for the fiscus. We've made some real progress in recent years, albeit at the cost of the potential for deep distrust between the employer and organized labor in the public sector. Whatever the strategy adopted, whether it's headcount, you know, however much there are costs for trying to achieve stabilization of compensation spending, whether one uses a remuneration-focused strategy or a headcount-focused strategy. What's critical is if we're going to hit this kind of 2% per year growth in compensation spending, we're going to have to be incredibly disciplined on both fronts, both in terms of hiring and also in terms of how fast we allow remuneration to grow. So Renette, that is all I have to say, and I'll take questions, but only if they're not hard.
Well, yes. Let me open the floor for questions, but let me also say that there's a team here with Antony. We've had Dr. Hermie Bourain, who's been a mainstay on the hard data crunching matters, and she can be part of the answering of questions, and also Liam James, who's been a wonderful source also on the data crunching side. But let me open it for discussion and start asking questions. Just before people come in, Anthony, could you just quickly just speak a little bit about what is available for people to look at? Perhaps just mention the details on the provincial work that you guys have done, and also the other sectoral work that is also per sector available. Sort of much more, I mean, obviously, great depth and detail per sector for the patterns that you find per sector. Just maybe worthwhile quickly just talking about that. This is already a massive mouthful, and I see there's quite a few hands, but just tell people about the other additional work as well. There's been a body of work that's been produced here.
Yeah, so most of this sure. Most of this has been published in various forms in medium-term budget policy statements. We've been writing an annexure for that since 2017, and so a lot of the work on which this presentation draws was done ultimately for the MTBPS. In addition to that, we did a big project in the last 12 months for IGR, looking at the individual provinces. That included some work on trying to estimate the potential for savings through various strategies relating to headcounts, early retirement, and the like. The short upshot of all of that is that there aren't big savings to be had in those strategies. And we've done, over time, we've done some work on some of the sectors, but we don't necessarily update that every year. So some of that is potentially a bit dated, but available through GTAC, and Ronette will know what she can share and what she can't, is quite extensive slide packs on the provinces, on education and health, on everything except education and health, that go into quite micro detail for like every department in every province, as well as for national level. So we can tell this kind of story, but personalized for each of those spending departments.
Yeah. No, thank you, Anthony. I mean, there's extensive. It's an extensive data source that have been really mined to bring out the patterns and understand that, and it's been a complex process. It's not an easy data base to work with. But let me go to the questions. Megan, you go first. Boichamelo, Emmanuel, that's our first round, and then let's try and answer all of that.
Thanks, Anthony. I have two questions. The first is, what are the implications for service delivery? Because you have someone like Michael Sachs speaking publicly saying that there are no more efficiencies to be made, and that we're essentially rolling back services. So is that what we're advocating for? And then the second question is whether South African public servants are overpaid. I've seen a World Bank measure which compared the cost of employees to the median wage, but I mean, we know the median wage in South Africa is barely even a decent wage. So you mentioned that there are other measures, so I'd just like to understand if that's the view, that we are overpaid.
Okay. We'll get to you then, Boichamelo, and then Emmanuel, and then we move for answers.
All right. Thanks, Anthony, for the great insights. Again, as an economist, I can sort of see it on both sides. And I think as someone who works on infrastructure, COE is one of those things that we blame, for the cuts that we've sort of seen in the infrastructure space, because if you have a limited envelope, COE comes with some level of permanency, in addition to just crowding out whatever other pressures you have. On the other side, though, I can also see, in fact, that's where I have questions. In economics, labor economics says that the growth in COE is not really an issue if you can match that growth to your productivity rate, right? And what I'm getting from, well, I just need to confirm from you, is the problem that we are raising around the rise in COE, the fact that we are not getting the concomitant productivity gains, and this is why it's such a big issue. Related to that is, with the rise in COE, have we necessarily seen an improvement or enhancement in terms of our service delivery as a government? That's sort of one set of question. And the next one is around the drivers. Sorry, Ronette. The next one is around the drivers. On the one side, I understand on the Q side, if you were to say Q times P, on the Q side, it's the number of people that are employed. I have not spoken to anyone who told me that we've got a surplus, in terms of our headcount. I've heard everyone saying we need more, we need more, we need more. So I just want to understand, based on the work that you have done, if there are areas where you can point out and say, there is our surplus, because I think that also assists in terms of...
Okay.
And
no,
the last one.
No, Boichamelo, we can't. I've got to ask you to wait for the next set of questions. Emmanuel, and then you can come back if there's time again. Emmanuel?
Thank you. My question will be a lot shorter. Your spending review, it looks like a really extremely detailed analysis, and we understand. I understand the value of it for the budget, right? I need to ask you, who do you try to influence apart from the budget on such a spending review? Because for me, this particular one would be an amazing basis to start discussing the very structure of the public service. In other countries, you have many more ranks, right? And you have, like we heard yesterday at the CBB colloquium, you have less people at the top. So I just want to know if you are able to also influence the discourse on the professionalization of the public service, but the very structure of it. Thank you.
I think, Anthony, take this round of questions and then we could go for a second round. Emmanuel, I'm going to lower your hand.
So I think I very pertinently asked for not difficult questions, and look what you've done to me. I'm going to try answer all of them because they are very, very good questions. So let me start with the question of service delivery and productivity, which I'm going to try and answer together. It is true that compensation spending, remuneration rises are not as problematic if productivity rises at a corresponding rate. There are some real challenges in measuring productivity in the public sector because the nature of the services sector generally, whether public sector or private sector, it's very hard to measure productivity. And it's particularly difficult in the public sector. This is a universal problem. It's just difficult to set good metrics for the public sector and to figure out what's going on with productivity. However, I think would be very surprising. I would be very surprised at an outcome of any study that said that productivity in the public sector had risen by 50% in real terms between 2006 and 2019. I think that apart from the difficulties of establishing such a thing kind of scientifically, I'm just going to stop presenting if nobody minds. I just think that that's not our experience, right? That's not how we think about it. And the reason we don't think about it is because it's really important how we think, what drives productivity? Productivity is not, there's sometimes people think about productivity as a kind of individual characteristic, that Boichamelo is more productive than Antony because Boichamelo's got a better degree or something like that. And on some levels, there's some truth to that at an individual level. But as a general proposition, what drives productivity growth in a public sector or in an economy is the combination of human labor with better technology, more capital equipment, more equipment, and the like. And what we know about the rise of compensation spending in South Africa, and Boitumelo in fact made this point, is that it has crowded out spending on complementary inputs. It's crowded out spending on infrastructure spend. It's crowded out spending on textbooks and medical equipment and medicines, and all of those things mean that productivity levels can't have risen as fast as remuneration has. The second point I would make about that is that on some levels, what's important from a public finances point of view is not whether remuneration has grown faster or slower than productivity, but whether it's grown faster than revenues. And that's what has happened. So there's irrespective of the productivity question, there's the affordability question. And the affordability question is the big story in South Africa, because our economy has grown much more slowly than compensation spending has done. And so you've got this kind of irresistible force, immovable object kind of problem, where if compensation keeps growing faster than the economy, that can't be sustained forever. There are serious implications for service delivery for a headcount focus strategy. There's no, and this goes to the question I think that Megan was asking, was like, how, are we overstaffed? And I think Boitumelo also asked the same question. I'm trying, Renette, but let me give proper answers. We are not an overstaffed public service. I think you have to be careful here, because public services are structured in enormously different ways across the world, and it isn't straightforward to compare the size of one public service to another. The classic example of that is that both the UK and France have national health schemes, but in France, it's done on a kind of outsourced basis. And so doctors and nurses are not considered public servants. And in the UK, it's done through the NHS, and it's the largest part of the public service. It's in Europe. So it's not straightforward to compare, who's to compare public services, because of different structures in the way services are organized. What we know is that South Africa's public service on a per capita basis is not big. It's certainly not outrageously big. And it's definitely not big in relation to the social need that we have, because we're the most unequal country in the world. So there's no question that we could do better with more public servants. But the public servants also have to be affordable, and that's where this question of overpaid arises. So what metrics we have for overpaid, again, it's hard to do this well. Some of the best work what it tries to do is it tries to say, what does the average public servants earn in comparison to GDP per capita? And on those kinds of metrics, South Africa does very poorly. That our public sector is poorly in the sense that our public sector is well paid. Maybe poorly is the wrong language to use. But our level of remuneration in comparison to what the economy can afford is quite high. And that's true from teachers to right across the public sector, with the one exception. Maybe I'll just say that to soothe everybody in this room's ego. One exception is managers. Managers in South Africa's public service do not appear to be overpaid by global standards. Final question, Emmanuel asked about who we're trying to influence. So from the very beginning, the reason this went into the MTBPS was to shape public discourse and also to shape the thinking of policymakers in government, because Treasury doesn't have control over the compensation budget directly. It certainly doesn't have control over remuneration strategy. And historically, there's been quite a lot of difficulties between Treasury and DPSA in terms of strategy. And so one of the reasons we were public is because we decided that often the conversation amongst policymakers is premised on fake news and false facts. And so the idea that there had been no progress made on the apartheid wage gap in the public service was very, very strongly held. And as a matter of fact, as I showed in one of the slides, there's been enormous progress made in equalizing remuneration in the public sector. So the idea was to talk to the whole of government, but also talk to the public and put facts on the table so that we could shape the way the world and the understanding of what was going on in the public service. That's my answers.
Renate, you are muted.
Yeah, I see that. It's a fascinating discussion, and those that need to go should go. Drop off colleagues. I mean, we said 2 to 3, but those that want to continue to talk to Antony, why don't we just take the time? Why don't we just continue with this conversation? So I see there are 2 hands, Barley and Jonathan. Barley, please go, and then I'll talk about Julius's question as well. Barley?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Antony. My one question is in the chat, but my other question relates to linking the spending more towards the performance, in the sense that I'd like to know if there's been any performance data external to the PERSAL environment that you may have introduced into the analysis to sort of get a better understanding of the trends and how things have changed in relation to performance. So, for example, how education is one of the big spenders. Is there some relationship to that with the learner-teacher ratios, for example? Just going to stop there.
Sorry, Mbali, I can't concentrate on listening to questions and reading questions. Why don't you just say whatever your question was that you put in the chat?
Oh, then the second question was, you had touched on 2 potential areas that could help curb the growth of COE. So the one was reducing the spend and the other was reducing headcount. However, I'm interested in knowing which method of reducing compensation spending do you think is more sustainable for slowing the growth in spending?
That's a little tough one, but let me ask Jonathan Ferreira. Why don't you just ask your question, and then we give Antony a time. I'll come and read Julius's question to you, Antony. But Jonathan?
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks for the presentation, Antony. Very, very insightful. So this question, it's not something that's going to come out of the data, but I am just wondering if you have any thoughts or insights. Is what does the future look like after the Constitutional Court judgment? So I'm specifically worried that the last little bit of your graphs all look quite nice coming down, whatever, but I suspect that what the unions are going to do, the public sector unions is going to say, stuff you guys negotiated in bad faith, but we're going to claw back what we lost in the last year in future negotiations. Do you have any insight or thoughts on that?
Softly. Let's answer these questions, and then we try to do 3 questions at a time. Okay, let's have a round of 3, and then it becomes sort of doable. Antony?
So we have looked at some. We have tried to do some things in relation to looking at compensation spending and performance, but it's, as I said, it's not straightforward. There are better measures, well, more reliable measures like the one you suggested, which is learner-teacher ratios, which are not so much performance measures as they are measures of workload. And there's how much workload is there on the criminal justice system, for example. So this is something I used to do a lot of work on. And one of the things that is true about the South African criminal justice system is that per capita, the criminal justice system is not terribly understaffed. Per murder, it's dramatically understaffed by global standards. So how you define the workload of the public service can shape how you think about whether we're over or understaffed and what performance means. So although per 100,000 people, the number of police officers in South Africa is not unusual by global standards, because we have a very, very high murder rate, the number of police officers per murder is an outlier. We do look very bad when you think about it in those terms. And I think one should think about those sorts of we should think about learner-teacher ratios from that point of view as well. You know, the evidence is all over the shop about how important class size is for the performance of kids and for learning outcomes. What is clear is that the more kids there are, the more teachers you need. Whatever the technology you have for teaching is obviously going to be under more strain the more kids there are and the fewer teachers there are. So that's more of like a workload measure than a performance measure. Measuring performance is really hard. I mean, in the criminal justice system, you can't really measure crime rates because that's kind of endogenous in some ways to the criminal justice system itself. But also, and the measurement of it is very poor. but maybe you can measure how many people get convicted or something like that. And on those measures, our performance has declined from the data that I've seen. I'm going to very, very gently not try and talk not too much about which strategy is sustainable. I think it is the case that if over 15 years remuneration increases has been driving what's happened on compensation budgets, then you've got to take that very seriously as how to adapt, in particular in a scenario in which the economy is doing as badly as it is now. I think that there are real concerns about in fact, even from the point of view of equity, about what it means for the public sector, remuneration in the context in which unemployment is skyrocketing and remuneration outside of the public sector is fairly stagnant. There's definitely going to be issues in the next rounds of negotiations with organised labour. They've already signalled, they've said publicly, they're very unhappy with the way the last round of negotiations transpired and what happened at the end of it. They definitely, in the last round, before when the outcome was the non-pensionable allowance, the demands made by the unions were greatly exceeded that. I mean, it was CPI plus 4, I think, was the original demand. So there's definitely going to be a lot of that down the road, and there is no question that there are trust issues now that there might not have been 4 or 5 years ago.
I think that's where we're going to stand with that question. Let me say there's a question from Julius. It's been in the chat for a while. Julius, are you still here? Do you want to speak to your question, or shall I just read it out? I'm going to give you 2 seconds to start talking. Not?
I can see his question. So I can.
There you go. So for everybody that's not opening up the chat box, there's sort of a technical question about linking the data sets between the per cell data that we've been working with and the SARS tax income data set. I know Dr. Bahrain has been looking at that. I don't know, how far it has moved. It is complex because all of this stuff is sensitive and has to be handled with the secrecy that it requires. This is personal information of people. So I know that the project hasn't really moved on that score, but we'll be happy to open up that discussion again. But then, Anthony, the one on, do you think the persistent increase in average remuneration in the government has had a distortionary effect in the private sector? Now, yeah, there goes a big question. And then I'm going to get Will and Boichamelo a chance after this.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try and answer both because we did do some work with the SARS data. So of course the SARS data that we've got access to is anonymized. So what we've done with it, and what you can't do very well is you can't, we haven't been able to in any case, is match like for like. You can't really compare apples with apples. So a person with a tertiary degree teaching, it's very hard to compare them in the SARS database with somebody equivalent. What we do know is that if you compare the whole distribution of income in the public sector to the whole distribution of income for all taxpayers, the public sector is much higher than all taxpayers until about the 97th percentile, at which point the private sector, the people in the 97th percentile on the tax base earn more than people on the 97th percentile of the public sector. But below that level, the people at 5% level percentile in the public sector earn considerably more than people in the 5% percentile of taxpayers generally. But it isn't a comparison of like by like, so one has to be a bit cautious of that. Whether it's distorted the private sector is a very interesting question. There's been evidence in both directions that what we will say is that based on the QES data, the rise in remuneration in the public sector is actually not very different from the rise in average remuneration in the private sector. They've both risen quite considerably over time. What we can't see from that data is the distributional consequences of that. And my guess is that the rise in average remuneration, because that's all you can see from the QES data really, the rise in average remuneration in the private sector has been driven by increases at the top, whereas the rise in remuneration in the public sector has been driven by increases at the bottom. So there's been a big equalizing of incomes in the public sector and a big disequalizing moment in the private sector. So I think that although the averages have grown at similar rates, and on average the public sector earns more than the private sector, both have grown at similar rates. But I think that the composition of that growth is quite different. But that is a hypothesis rather than a finding. So you must just take it as somewhat speculative. Was there another question, Renette? I can't remember.
No, I think we're done with that now. Will and Boichamelo in that sequence.
Thank you, Renette. Anthony, wonderful presentation. I'm in the infrastructure space, and we tend to see a lot of course, it's all published, unauthorized and wasteful expenditure. I was wondering if your assessment has looked at that, the published wasteful expenditure vis-a-vis remuneration.
No. I mean, we use the Purcell data. It's anonymized, although the truth is that if we really want to figure out what Renette earns, we could do it, but through various bits of triangulation. We've never attempted to do that and won't. But no, we don't know anything about the decision that has gone into somebody earning X. All we know is we have the data from Purcell that says that they earn X. So we can't tell you any more than that.
No, forgive me, I'd like to clarify. No, I'm talking about the money that just disappeared. I'm not talking about an individual. I'm talking about money that goes into faulty projects, let's say. Right. Just people stick it in their pocket. So what does that say in relation to remuneration? May I?
Yeah, no, we haven't done anything like that. I can't tell you anything useful from the work we've done.
Yeah, I just want to come in and say that the definition of irregular expenditure in government is quite broad. So be very careful. I know that we had a figure of 166 billion irregular expenditure last year, but a lot of that is not necessarily materially irregular. It is somebody didn't fill in the form, and therefore all the expenditure around this. So I'm very careful about all of that. But let's focus on this again. Boichamelo?
Yeah. Last question from me, I promise. So I mean, skilled labor is quite mobile, right? And I just want to find out from you whether you think that there is a risk with how we've been managing the wage bill, that the people that we actually want to keep might leave the system, and the ones that we actually would like for them to go, and they end up just remaining within the system because it does look like it may be benefiting them. They're getting more than what they would be getting in the private sector. The productivity may not be as high, and those kinds of issues. I know it's not a policy question, but I just think it's an interesting question for me that I would just like to hear your thoughts on.
Well, it is. I think it is a policy question, because this is the downside of natural attrition, which is the kind of adverse compositional consequences of natural attrition. Is you would expect that people who have more options are more likely to leave than people who have fewer options. So that kind of some of what you're talking about. There's also a problem, which is a different problem, which is that senior people in public service have not seen their salaries increase anything like the public sector generally, and they have not seen their salaries increase at the rate at which they've increased in the private sector. And that is a problem for long-term sustainability and attracting and retaining high-skilled and experienced managers. So the OSDs, that's why they were introduced. The original motivation for the OSDs was really about the doctors. There was a doctor strike in 2005, 2006. And the OSDs was partly a response to that, in order to create conditions of service that would attract and retain doctors in the public sector. Doctors are not in that group who have not seen real increases over time, because although they earn more, some of them earn more than DGs, they're not counted as levels 14, 15, and 16. They're actually counted as levels 10s and 11s, and so they've seen increases in their remuneration, but not as much as low down in the system. So there is a problem. There is a problem of attracting and retaining skilled people. I think that's the bigger challenge for government as a whole is making sure people can deliver, because it's one thing to be paid well. It's another thing to work in a system that works and which has the complementary inputs and the other things you need in order to do your job well. And I think that sometimes in a lot of departments, that's what the problem is. I don't know if you've seen in the last few days, there's been problems at Baragwanath where there's no money for buying food for patients and things like that. And so, that's an unpleasant place to work if you're a doctor who wants to care for people, and the hospital is unable to provide food for patients.
Colleagues, I'm gonna have to say, let's call it a halt. Clearly, this is a topic that can be discussed again and again, and further aspects, and perhaps we should indeed do that. Maybe put some more detailed discussions around specific sectors forward, that people can see some of the work that's happened there. But I think the important point is we've opened up these discussions. You now know about some of the work that has happened here. The team with Antony, Hermie and Liam, there's an absolute wonderful array of work available from them, deeply thought about, really sort of with considered attention to what is possible and how to understand those patterns. I think it's been some breakthrough work and has saved government money. But let's continue these conversations in the next Friday. There will be another topic. Let me just now say thank you very much to Antony. Really pleased to have you here to open this up. I can see, the attendance was strong. We had over 90 people here. And clearly there's going to be a discussion, hopefully in the streets or in the passages. I don't know where we are now at the moment on this. I don't know if you want to be discussed in the streets, Antony. But people
already do, I think.
So there you are. I also want to say, those of you that want to join us now for our little training session, we are now going to look at how at past we're going to go for a different link. It should be in the chat box, your link to link into this. There is a little training, Fundanati, on how to use OneDrive, which is the big treasury move for all of us in IT. But for now, thank you very much. Those clever people that asked the difficult questions as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antony. It's wonderful to sit and listen to this. Most appreciate this. Bye-bye, everybody. See you next week.
Enjoy your weekends.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.